Welcome, conservationists. We're going to be talking today about choosing grass and cover that meets your goals. And what I should have wrote on there when I made the title of this thing is your habitat goals. Yes, your goals might also include other natural resources, soil and water quality. Conservation cover helps protect those resources. But today we're going to be focusing on the habitat side of things specifically. So just wanted to drill that down a little bit just in case there was any confusion. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jason Anderson. I am a wildlife biologist for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. I work with landowners to establish and manage wildlife habitat in agricultural areas. I work in a partnership with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they are partnered with other local conservation groups to fund our positions. Without those partnerships, I would literally not be able to do my job. So I wanted to say thanks at the beginning of this. So first off, when we talk about cover, I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about. When I refer to cover or grassland cover specifically, we're talking about the vegetation that covers the soil. So it's the stuff that's out there growing, right? And so in this picture, this is actually in Mills County. There's a lot of representation here. We'll be talking about pretty much all of this, except for the trees. So we're talking about grasslands. Specifically, we're also kind of going to be lumping in crop areas or either row crop or small grains. So that would constitute as cover as well. But we're going to be mostly talking about grassland cover. And in the bottom right here, there's this is all kind of remnant prairie that has never been plowed. Then there's lawn grass that is constitutes as cover. And then back here is a prairie reconstruction, native grass reconstruction, same way with over here. And then of course you see the woodland cover on the side. So just keep in mind that cover constitutes or includes a lot of different stuff. And when we talk about conservation cover, really we're just talking about the plants. So topic overview, we're going to quickly talk about vision and goals, establishing vision and goals for your farm, because I am very goal driven. All my decision making that I push people through, I try to have it be goal driven. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about something that I honestly completely made up, the habitat gradient. So it is a bad, good, better sort of gradient of different habitat types, if you want to think of it like that. And then the different choices that you will that there are out there as far as cover choices that will accomplish your habitat goals, and then how to strike a balance between those choices and the resources that you have available to you. And then a quick summary on making it happen. And that is actually going to lead into a select group of topics that we will discuss later, because actually enacting all this stuff it's a big thing. And so that's part of what we'll talk about in future sessions. Today, it's mostly going to be the decision-making part of it. So informing the options and then trying to hedge towards a decision on accomplishing habitat goals specifically. First of all, we're going to talk about vision and goals. If you were here at the last one, I recycled this slide because I love it. So if you need a reminder, you need to set your goals. Think about what you have as a vision for your land, for the project, and then set goals that work towards those goals. Okay. If you don't have goals, think of it like a mission statement. If you don't have goals, then you kind of lose your way. If you have a vision and goals for your farm, for the project, then every decision you make, you can refer back to that vision to see if you are accomplishing your goal. So it's a yes, no kind of thing. I like it clean cut like that. If you are faced with a decision, ask yourself, is it accomplishing what I want? If not, don't do that thing. If yes, consider doing that thing. It's pretty simple, quite honestly. Vision, goals. If you don't, write them down, because super, super important. Okay, now we're going to get into the habitat gradient. So this is not, I just want to preface this by saying this is not scientific. This is based on my experience as a biologist, and based on my knowledge, doing lots of school for biology, and then based on my field experience, seeing what is actively out on the ground. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I want you to think about it in a way that it is a gradual increase in habitat value, okay? When you establish your vision and your goals, then you can ask yourself, where do the goals that I have in mind, my habitat goals, align along this gradient? And you can kind of feel where the project would fall, and that'll give you a good guide, okay? So starting left to right, row crop, introduced grass, those two, I would say, are the baseline of kind of what we're working with in most cases. If you were to throw a dartboard at the state of Iowa, a map of the state of Iowa, chances are the dart is going to land either on row crop, very highly likely, or introduced grass. And most of the time in introduced grass, we're talking about smooth brome. We'll get more into that later. Food plot, that would be slightly more traveling off to the right there, increasing in habitat value as we go. A food plot would be more small grains specifically planted for wildlife value. Slightly higher value than row crop and introduced grass because it's different stuff than what we already have, okay? So that's what I mean when the row crop and introduced grass, we have lots of that in Iowa, and it doesn't necessarily, I don't want to say it doesn't have any value because that's not true. It does have value, but it is on the low side of the spectrum, okay? As we increase, go right and increase in habitat value, we have introduced grasses and legumes. So that would be introduced grasses with introduced legumes. So we think about like a hay mix, for example, like pictured in there is introduced grasses, forage grasses with red clover is what the legume is in that photo. And when I say introduced, I mean it is not from here originally, okay? As far as defining terms goes, introduced species, when we say that, that means it was transported here to the United States from another location. In most of the cases, it's going to be Europe or Asia. If an introduced species is not from here, it could be invasive. We'll talk about that later, but introduced species are not from here. And because of that, the wildlife species that are here, that are native to the state, don't necessarily benefit from those species as much as they would, which brings us actually to the native side. Okay, so on the right, those two boxes, the native grass and native grasses and wildflowers. When we say native, that means from here. So I personally, Jason Anderson, and I am an Iowa native. I was born here and raised here, and I am from here. So if I go somewhere else, I am introduced. If I am here where I belong, I'm native. Okay, if you want to think of it like that. But even in the native grass and wildflowers, there's an increase there as well. And one of the things I want to point out as we go from left to right, we are increasing in habitat value, subjectively increasing in habitat value. Like I said, it's not necessarily scientific. It's just based on my own experience and dealing with other conservation professionals and kind of what the general feeling is. It's hard to quantify, but either way, increasing in habitat value going to the right. And also you're increasing in diversity, which is essentially diversity is the number of different species that are in your stand, in your grassland stand. And you're also increasing in the native component. Row crop, most of that stuff is all either introduced or it is synthetic. It was produced in a lab. Introduced grass, most of that is going to be from Europe. As we go up into food plot, some of that stuff is going to be essentially like row crop. It is going to be seeds that were genetically created. And then as we go right, then we get more diversity. It's more stark that we see that change where we get more diversity, more native component. And then finally at the very end with native grass and wildflowers, we have lots of native stuff. It's all native and there is lots and lots of different species. Okay. So that's what I kind of mean. It's a multifaceted gradient where we have increased habitat value as we go along the gradient, as well as more diversity and a higher amount of native component to the stand. I just want to double down and just remind you that just keep this in mind. We're going to talk about these different options. And it's not like a menu where you choose what you want for dinner necessarily. It's a gradient. So there's a lot of gray area. There are intermediaries in between these things. And you can mix and match on this stuff as well. It's not a one size fits all kind of deal. There are lots of options. That's the unfortunate thing about land management, is that it can be as complicated as you want it to be, or don't want it to be, I suppose, as far as that goes. But yes, this is a decision-making tool to kind of visualize the different options and the different subtleties that you're going to be faced with. Later on, I'm going to talk about the Conservation Reserve Program. It is a USDA program. I'm not going to talk about it a lot because I want to keep these talks program neutral. But a lot of people that enroll in different conservation covers are doing it through the Conservation Reserve Program through the USDA. And these cover types, well, not the row crop necessarily, but the other cover types, they directly correspond to different conservation practices through the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. So when we're discussing and talking about these different ones, they might have a code. The government loves codes. So conservation practice would be like CP is what they will refer to it as in the Conservation Reserve Program. There's all these CP numbers, CP1 or 2 or 12 or whatever. And all of those correspond to these different categories. We're talking about the most broadest ones, and we're doing it in more general terms, non-programmatic terms, so that this applies to more people. But just know that these translate directly to the Conservation Reserve Program. We talked about the habitat gradient. If we have goals, we can kind of figure out where our goals will land in the different options we have. Okay, so we'll get into those different steps in the gradient by talking about these different cover choices, and we're going to lump them together. So when we talk about the gradient, I have it kind of broke out into 5-6 different sections. We're going to lump them together, and we'll talk about them in kind of pairs. So first, we're going to talk about the row crop food plot side of things. I feel like I have to talk about this because there is just so much row crop in Iowa. I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's high. Wildlife needs food too. That's the basic thing. But if you think about it, Iowa is essentially one gigantic food plot. Row crop is kind of the baseline. And a lot of these times we are going from, when we're doing conservation planting, it is for people that are transferring from row crop, usually through a program like Conservation Reserve Program, and they are seeding down a row crop field to perennial vegetation for conservation reasons. And in this, we're talking about specifically about wildlife, but you could also do it for soil and water quality and all sorts of other reasons. But think about row crop as the baseline. And if you were going to, a lot of people, they will put down food plots, and a food plot is, in this picture on the right, that is a bunch of commercial sunflower that is seeded into, is basically commercial sunflower planted as a row crop. And they do that for wildlife, specifically for hunting upland game birds, doves and quail specifically. They really like those small grain plantings like that, but it benefits other stuff as well. Pollinators, songbirds, insects. There's a lot of stuff that utilizes food plots, and in much in the same way, there's a lot of wildlife that will utilize row crop as well. Just ask any farmer about deer and turkey in their row crop, especially around where it comes up against field edges. I mean, wildlife uses these areas. I don't want to say that they're worthless, because they're not, but they are on the low side of the spectrum. A lot of people will want to do food plots for hunting, and they ask me, Jason, how good is a food plot for wildlife? And I mean, honestly, my answer is that in most cases, food is not a limiting factor for wildlife in Iowa, at least not the ones that would eat that stuff, that would eat small grains. You're talking about pheasant, quail, turkey, deer, the larger wildlife that we would normally think of, they are not, I mean, you would be pretty hard pressed to find a farm in Iowa that is not within 1 mile of a row crop field. That's why I say that Iowa is basically one big food plot, because they can go get that stuff. Wildlife can go get that stuff anywhere. So I don't place a whole lot of value on food plots and not row crops either. Really what I want to talk about are the grass practices. They introduce grass in the native, they introduced in the native practices. And I'm going to lump the introduced stuff together, because again, we're talking about this as a gradient. So there's a lot of gray area and it's honestly kind of mushed together. So we're just going to talk about it in a block. When we talk about, again, when we talk about introduced cover, we mean that it came from somewhere else. And most of our introduced grass species came from Europe with European settlement, because it's what they knew, right? So when we're talking about erosion control or hay mixes or whatever, we want to work with the stuff that we are familiar with, because that's nice and safe. And so we bring that with, and that is what we work on, and that's what we've always known. Compared to row crop, I would say any introduced cover is better. At least it is grass and it's perennial vegetation. And wildlife does use, I should say, on the left side, that is all smooth brome. That is the grass species that is extremely common. It is, it's introduced, it's from Europe. You cannot go anywhere without finding smooth brome. It's in every ditch and fence row and terrace and prairie, honestly, in Iowa, practically. And what it does there is it'll just form this monoculture grassland stand. It'll often look just like it does in that picture, where it's just one solid block of introduced grass. And brome isn't necessarily bad. It is just, I mean, there's no getting rid of it. It's invasive in prairies, but there's no getting rid of it. And it does have some amount of benefit, although it is not an exciting level of benefit, just slightly better than row crop, I would say. So if you are considering doing a conservation planting, introduced grass is the least exciting thing of your options. It is, it's not particularly great for wildlife. There's not a lot of species that will utilize it, although it does have some benefits in that it is cheap and very accessible. So it's easy to get a hold of in seed brome, and it establishes very readily, and that's why people like it. We could really get in the weeds, so to speak, about talking about the pros and cons of that, as far as, getting into it a little bit deeper, but I kind of want to move on because it makes me sad talking about brome and how it actually is not horrible. I hate brome. I'm just going to be honest with you. So we're going to move over to the introduced grass and legume side. It is slightly better. So if you think about, if you have a monoculture of introduced grass, like what you have on the left side, compare it with what you see on the right side, that is actually what I would consider to be a diverse mix of introduced stuff. This is what you would see in a nice hay field or maybe a pasture that they're growing that maybe for forage production, but it also has a lot of benefit for wildlife. You might have multiple different species of introduced grasses, smooth brome or fescue, timothy, orchard grass. Those are all introduced forage grasses that people will put into those kind of mixes, as well as different introduced legumes like red clover or white clover or alsite clover. There's a bunch of different clovers, legumes, that would be good choices for that. And I don't have it on here, but you could also put native wildflowers in there as well. There's a lot of native wildflowers that compete very well with introduced grasses. I like to refer to that as the Iowa ditch mix, because if you recall, most Iowa ditches, roadsides, are introduced grass, smooth brome. But if you think about all the different wildflowers that you see out there, like those are the ones that would compete well with introduced grasses, specifically smooth brome, and you would have a fairly diverse stand if you don't want to get rid of your introduced grass. There's a lot of benefit there because of those flowers that the legumes have. It provides habitat for pollinators and insects, and also the things that eat those pollinators and insects. So birds and possums and mammals and all kinds of stuff. It adds more to the food web, if you will. The higher amount of diversity you have in a stand, the more resources it will provide for the wildlife. Looking back at the left side with the monoculture, it's not providing a whole lot because there's literally one species that is in that field, whereas you have multiple species that's on the right side. It's all introduced, but the more species you have, more species of plants you have, the more it is going to provide for different species of wildlife, and they will take advantage of that. Moving from introduced stuff into native stuff. So native grass and native grasses and wildflowers in a mixture. I think that this looks way better just from an aesthetic point of view, but again, I fully admit that I am biased. This is not the same field, by the way. I know that in the image, the trees kind of line up and the hill lines up, but that was purely coincidence. These are completely different farms and counties. When we talk about native grass, I think it's important to understand why it's important. My advisor in graduate school, he always asked, whenever we were making a statement to him, he always asked, why should I care? And so when we talk about native cover, I always hear John's voice in my head saying, why should I care? And the reason is that we don't have a lot of native cover in Iowa. If you recall, the vast majority of Iowa is either farmed or it is developed, right? And so of the remainder of that, then you have a small piece of the pie that is dominated by smooth brome, and then you have what is left is native grass and, well, and trees and all kinds of other cover types. Okay, the reason that these native covers are important, if you think back to pre-European settlement, Iowa was covered by approximately 86% tallgrass prairie. Think Dances with Wolves. Maybe I'm dating myself with that movie. Kevin Costner is great, but if you think back to that, rolling just as far as the eye can see, tall grass. They said that you could tie knots over the back of a horse when you're going through it, and I believe that because tall grass gets its name because it is tall. Either way, 86% of the state was covered with tall grass prairie at one point in time. And after European settlement, after everything was plowed under, developed, farmed, not that I'm demonizing farmers or anything like that. I like food too, but that 86%, of that 86% originally in Iowa, there's less than 0.1% left. Okay. And the vast majority of that 0.1% of remaining remnant prairie is in the Luss Hills, where it was too steep to farm, the Luss Hills of Western Iowa. So when we talk about native cover and why it's important, there's not a lot, barely any fraction of what was pre-European settlement. And there is a lot of species, grassland wildlife species, that require, sorry, my cat wants in, hang on. Cats. No, I lost my, thanks, cat. And no, she's not even coming in. So there are grassland species that require those native grasses, the prairie, for reproduction. We call them obligate species, meaning they are obligated to have native grass habitat for reproduction. When I think about that, I think of songbirds because that's what I studied in school. Things like the grasshopper sparrow or the dickcissel, they absolutely have to have areas of native grass to nest in. And they won't necessarily do so if they don't have habitat that meets their needs. Same way with different butterfly species and bees. Monarch butterflies is another good example. They don't necessarily require native grass, but they require milkweed species, which are really only found in areas, large areas of grass, right? So there's all these wildlife species that rely on those native grass stands for reproduction. And so that is the reason that I personally care about those things, and why hopefully you will too. So if you're considering habitat good, if we go back to thinking about that gradient of habitat benefit, the native cover is going to, now the dogs are screaming out there. I'm going to try to ignore it. It's tough. I'm sorry, everybody. Sorry, I had to yell at him. Okay, there is so the native covers are going to benefit the largest number of wildlife species. Okay, so as you have more diversity of plant species, you're going to have more benefit for different wildlife species as well. Okay, and even in this picture, we can see that there's differences in plant diversity from both sides. Okay, so there's native grass on the left side where this is probably 90% native grass species with very few wildflowers in it, although you can see some in the picture. And then on the right side, obviously there's a bunch of wildflowers in there, and maybe it's even mostly wildflowers. But also something I want you to think about, not just diversity of species, but diversity of the structure of the plants itself. Okay. On both sides, you see that there's a lot of variability in the size and shape of the plants, in the height, different leaf types and sizes of stems, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of variability when you continue to increase that kind of diversity of plants. So there's a lot of diversity. And when we talk about structure, wildlife species, they will look for that diversity of structure. Going back to grassland birds, because that's something that I know quite a bit about. They are terrible botanists. The birds typically don't really care what species of plant they are looking at specifically, but they are looking for the structure that the habitat provides. They're just not very good at plant identification, but they're looking for the shape and the size of the plants and the ones that are adjacent for when they build their nests and do all their mating stuff. It's kind of interesting. So anyway, that's just another measure of diversity when you're thinking about it. It's not just the number of species, but also the community that composes the stand as a whole. So when we go back to the gradient, maybe it makes a little bit more sense now, where there's higher diversity of plants, more structure, more native component as we go from left to right on the gradient. So that's all fine and good, right? So basically, the better the habitat you can make, the better, but it needs to correspond to what your goals are, right? So if your goals, maybe you have a honeybee operation. Okay, so that might point you more in the introduce grass and legumes category, because introduce legumes, they provide a lot of forage for honeybees. Or maybe you are a pheasant hunter potentially, and you want to provide winter cover for pheasants so you can attract pheasants to your field or whatever. So maybe native grass is the way you want to go, because that is going to be really dense and stay upright in snow and provide a lot of winter cover for those birds. Or maybe you are interested in native butterflies and you want a pollinator garden, or field, or you saw a special on PBS about monarch butterflies and you want to do everything you can help, whatever. Native grass and wildflowers might be your thing. It's hard to say. So every project is going to be different. If you develop your vision and set goals for yourself on what you want to accomplish, what habitat good you want to accomplish, then you can look at that gradient and think about it and say, okay, well, where would my project necessarily fall in there? And it might require some extra research, and definitely probably would. But this is just kind of a very general idea of that gradient and the trend as you increase in habitat value, what you'd be kind of looking at. And so there's a balance that needs to be struck, and that's what we're going to talk about next. between that habitat good and all the stuff that it takes to get there. And I made this really corny graphic here. If you're so you have to strike that balance between the goals and the costs. Okay, so that's all great. We talked about basically habitat value up to this point, and that's all fine and well and good, but it takes something to get to that point, right? It takes money, it takes resources, the tools to do the stuff, time, and then also there are management implications for all those different cover types as well. I wish we could get into that stuff, and we probably will in future sessions, but it's a lot of territory to cover. If you are doing research on these different projects, kind of figure out like where, what are the implications for doing the cover type that you have? Do you have enough resources and money or whatever? We'll just say resources. Do you have enough resources to be able to make those or achieve those goals? Maybe money is not an object for you. And to that, I say, great, go forward and do good things. But for most folks, maybe that means that you are going to have to break up your project into phases. You do this corner first, or the highest priority area first, work on that, work on another section afterwards. I mean, it's just every situation is different. Oh, and one thing that I wanted to, I'll go back here. I'll go back again. The starting point might be different, and that is going to directly correlate with the costs. So if you are starting, if the ground is in question is currently in row crop and you want to seed it down to native grass and wildflowers, well, that might be fairly resource intensive, we'll say. Native grass and wildflowers, the seed mix for that is not inexpensive, but it's let's see, it is definitely more than introduced grass, certainly. Whereas just converting or upgrading cover, if you have a native grass stand that's in pretty good shape, but it doesn't have a whole lot of diversity, and all you need to do is add some wildflowers to that mix, well, that might not be so bad. Same way if you have an introduced grass stand that you want to get some legumes into or some native wildflowers, it's not too terrible of a price to get it up into that. So that's what I say, that you need to evaluate your situation, be realistic, evaluate your situation, and evaluate the cost to habitat benefit and see where you want to go. The main thing is you have to weigh it against the cost of the implementation. So if you just as a whole, be realistic about what resources you have and what you want to accomplish. And then if you need to, break it up. Definitely, that is the way to go. So lastly, I'm going to summarize it. We're going to talk about it in a making it happen kind of way in very general terms. This is the slide that's got the most words on it because this is basically the summary of the talk. Okay, we're nearing the end. So really what it comes down to is set goals, make a plan, and make it happen, right? That whole make it happen thing, that is a large umbrella of topics. So set goals, make a plan, and make that plan happen. So first, you need to set a vision, figure out what your vision is, set realistic goals for it, and then determine what cover types, I put plural in there, meet your goals, because you might want to utilize multiple different cover types for your project. You don't need to be limited to just necessarily one. And also remember that it's a gradient of options too. So there's a lot of in between in those gaps as well. So once you figured out what kind of cover type you're targeting, then you want to find the balance between that cover type and whatever the cost is. And you need to consider your resources, how much money you got in your wallet, and then what the long-term management needs of the stand is. And that can vary quite a bit as well. Resources and management are two things that people don't necessarily think about in the long term. And we'll, in future sessions, I'm going to talk about that in more depth. Unfortunately, I'm trying to keep we're hitting the foundational stuff in these earlier sessions, but we're going to talk a lot more about management in the future, certainly. Not lastly, I guess, but make a plan for implementation. And that is a lot of where I come in. And just professionally at the bottom there, I say also ask for help. I can help with any of these categories or people that do work in private lands like me. My job is literally to help landowners work on projects like this. We can help inform those kinds of choices and help people make decisions. And I want to specifically talk about just a little bit, just hit on funding opportunities for different implementing conservation plantings or putting conservation cover on the ground. One, I already mentioned it, is the Conservation Reserve Program that is specifically set aside for farm ground that is currently or has in the past been row cropped. There's cropping history, they call it, that is required to enroll in the Conservation Reserve Program. But you can receive an annual rental rate to enroll crop ground into perennial cover. And typically, although the annual rental rate does not change, it is easier and better, certainly, to enroll native covers through the Conservation Reserve Program. And then also, if the USDA, if you don't have the option to do USDA programs like CRP, then there are other alternatives. And there's a lot of different programs out there. These are just the biggest two. And if I don't use CRP, a lot of times I will use this program called Prairie Partners, which is administered through the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and the Iowa Native Seed Growers Association. For smaller scale projects, Prairie Partners is excellent because we can use that to get half of the seed cost paid for native plantings. And the seed cost is generally the vast majority of the cost of implementation for projects like that. So if we can get some money for seed, then great. But typically I don't look at funding programs until we have a good plan in place for what we want to do. And then we figure out how we can get some cost assistance along with it. And then the last step, make it happen. Well, okay, I get it that's that's kind of like, well, just do that. And there's not a lot of detail there because there are so many different projects that how to actually get about that is going to be different. So in July, my talk is going to be about converting areas of introduced grass to native prairie. And so that's one of the examples of how I'm going to continue to talk about that in the future. So if you're interested in that, be sure to come back. But again, asking for help. So if you have questions on any of these kind of things, or if you're working with folks that have questions on these kind of things, and I know there's a couple of conservation professionals in here. If you have questions on how you can help other people make those decisions, also happy to help with that for sure.